Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special segment of Captain Morgan's Librarius. I am happy to bring you finally the follow up interview to our mental health in the hobby segment from a few weeks ago. And I have with me Dr. Chris Nahumck.
Hi, everyone.
And I'm really excited to not only share with him some of the questions that I received from you in the audience, but also to talk about mental health in the hobby in more of an open one-on-one format and sort of a long form thing. As much as we all love reading the super long articles that I write for everybody, it's a lot easier to listen nowadays, especially if you got something to do like wash the dishes. That's like my prime podcast time. So, Chris, thank you for answering the questions before. And of course, thank you for being here and talking to me about this at all. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice, and all of that.
Well, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Southern California, in the Pasadena area. I work in a group practice with quite a few other people. The group practice is called Sync Counseling Centers. Um, I've been doing therapy for I'd say about 14 years through school. I've been in private practice on my own for about 3 years at this point. But I've got a PhD and three masters and been doing this for a while. My practice specializes in grief and loss and men's issues beyond the typical couples therapy, depression, anxiety, stress, that kind of stuff. So grief and loss and men's issues are really kind of the thing that makes me a little bit different.
That's really cool. I know when I'm gonna bring myself up a lot in this because I work with mental health stuff quite a bit. I myself I have PTSD. My wife has depression. We go to counselors for all these things. We go to counselors together. So mental health is sort of a big deal for me. Part of why I wanted to bring this up and talk about it in general. But also, I remember at a very critical time in my life, one of the big things that helped me as a man was some getting some advice from people who specialized in dealing with men's issues. And it would kind of was the tip of an iceberg that I didn't really understand, like how underserved in some cases men are, even from their own attention, from a perspective of their own attention. How would you say your experience working with men in that respect has been?
Um, I think sometimes the hardest thing is having them come in the door, if that
Hmm.
makes any kind of sense, because often men are taught that we're not supposed to um, really have feelings, or if we do, they should be a very narrow subset, and we're not supposed to really dwell on them. Um, but not dealing with our feelings is quite literally killing us. Yeah, men are successfully complete suicide 4 times more often than women do. Men are more likely to be victims of violent crime in addition to committing violent crime. They're 96 to 97% more, uh, 96 or 97% of the workplace fatalities. Um, it's just there's lots of risk and danger actually that comes from being male. Um, you know, some people would make the argument that men are the ones who are responsible for much of the problems in the world and much of the violence in the world. But my counter to that would be that most of the time, the vast majority of men who are in those kind of positions are pretty much doing what society has asked them to do, and it's a very uh, narrow path. It's a knife edge to walk. We've got to be, loving and caring and welcoming of our family, and also ready to murder anyone who comes through the door that's not supposed to be there.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and my actual dissertation was kind of talking about the fact there's this concept called it's called gender role conflict, and it's the way it's kind of developed was by a researcher whose name is last name is O'Neill, and he talked about uh, gender role conflict as being anytime there is conflict over what's required of you by your gender role, that and so this can be someone who doesn't feel like they fit the gender role of being a man, or someone who is maybe punishes other people for not fitting that stereotype, or who decides to kind of overinvest in it and become hyper masculinized, and all the problems that happen either to that individual or the people around them as a result of that. So it's a very broad concept. Um, but my argument, my dissertation, was actually that it's not a bug in the system; it's a feature of the system, and it's actually
Mm.
there to kind of highlight who is a better fit from an evolutionary point of view, because you're going to need people who are able to make these shifts and be able to read the situation to know what version of man is required in this moment. Is the version of man the one that needs to be the violent protector on behalf of the people around them, to play that role of hero, or is it um, the the version of man who is allowing his partner to sleep as he changes the newborn's diaper, because she's just exhausted from her day of mothering, and so he shoulders that burden of nurturing and caring in his own intimate way. So, I think as men, we're kind of, it's getting better, but there still are, men's issues I would define as any any problems or issues or conflicts that men come about simply because they're male,
Yeah.
and those are going to look different than they would um, from the female point of view.
Yeah, and I think, it's also important to point out because we are talking about men's issues specifically right at this moment, but it's not a contest, who has it worse so far as mental health. Everybody struggles a little bit different, and
Mm-hmm.
we can respect that and still talk about people's specific issues in that moment. My issues are not going to be the same as your issues are not going to be same as my wife's issues or a son or a
Right.
daughter, and you know it's okay to open up about those problems because you don't have to. If you as a man are you're hearing that everything that's wrong in the world is your fault, then if you can almost feel guilty about sharing the things that you're struggling with
Mm-hmm.
because you feel like, oh well, all of these things are going on in the world and it must be my fault. How dare I complain about stuff? It's like, no, you have to really figure all of that out for yourself, and you tackle your problems. And when you get yourself into a place where you can kind of stand on your own 2 feet, then that's the point where you're strong enough to lift up those around you and you can kind of expand your sphere of influence from there. That's
Mm-hmm.
at least that's my take on it. You're the professional. You tell me if I'm full of it.
Well, I don't think you're full of it. Uh, I think that's, yeah. I think George Carlin had a line. Maybe it's not even him, but I remember it as being him, where you want to be careful about you know how you equate things, because sometimes it's like calling yourself the valedictorian of summer school. It's not necessarily a title that really needs to happen. Other people have referred to it as like the victim Olympics, like trying to say who's got it the worst. Um, I think suffering is suffering, and you know, I think we can look at something and say, like, objectively, this person in like this, random situation may have it worse than this other person, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the first person's really suffering.
Yeah.
I think that's actually something we're seeing a lot currently. We're recording this in what, 7-ish months into COVID being in the United States, and the first kind of
Boy.
shutdowns of things.
Yeah.
And while everyone's kind of dealing with things in their own way, and we don't have to focus specifically on that, but one of the things that I just know is the case for a lot of people is, a lot of people are actually doing okay, and a lot of people are, like, if you look at their life, like they're not really suffering, and this hasn't negatively. They're able to work from home. They haven't lost their job. They're, everyone they know is healthy and safe, and no one's gotten sick, and they're able to kind of continue life as is, and they've found a way to do, like uh, the remote learning for their children, and all that kind of stuff. Like, so they've adapted pretty well, but that doesn't also mean at the same time that they haven't. We're all suffering trauma from this. We're all being, negatively impacted by this. We're all suffering. but often people are like, well, I don't have a right to complain because like it's not really that bad. But yet, depression right now has had a threefold increase since before COVID hit. Everyone is suffering. Relapse rates are up 30%. Suicides are on the rise, and that's just, it's a hard time for everyone. And to say I've got it worse than someone else, like maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that, you know, we should diminish anybody's suffering.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't feel like you can reach out for help. So
Yes.
I think that's an important message and clarification. Now we are talking about mental health in Warhammer and Warhammer 40K tabletop gaming, D&D gaming, however you want to put it, and it doesn't matter who's doing the suffering, but it is going to, because of the demographic split, at least currently, a lot of these things may resonate a little bit more with men, but they may
Hmm.
also be equally applicable to the women gamers in the community. We want to make sure that they're included as well in the conversation. But I think that the big thing, the big takeaway that we have, that I want to kind of open this up with, is the idea that everybody can talk about what's bothering them.
Absolutely. I think, having that space uh, to be able to discuss what's wrong is really important. And this is something that's kind of been talked about a lot in the community, on podcasts and um, the online milieu
Hmm.
lately. And we did that same kind of back and forth article as well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about it. But one of the things that I noticed, at least, um, and that's why I'm glad to have this opportunity, was that a lot of it was kind of people talking about how the hobby's been good for their mental health, and the hobby is good for mental health, and this is why. And so it's kind of like a congratulatory patting ourselves on the back for doing, this thing that we're doing is good for mental health. So it's like, yay, I've already been eating broccoli and like broccoli, so like I'm doing something good for me. And I don't want to diminish that. Like that absolutely is true. There's lots of benefits that come from the hobby, whether it's the social interaction or um, the the ability to kind of, it's actually a mindfulness practice of painting or building the models when you can really zone in. But sometimes that can actually be a problem, because if there's this thing that some people are doing that really is kind of opening up their world and making things better for them, and somebody else is looking at that and feeling, well, I'm doing all those things, but like I can't get there, like it's not helping, then often they feel shame because this thing that's supposed to help isn't helping anymore. And when you're already feeling crummy and you layer shame on top of that, it's just a recipe for things to kind of get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned sort of a specialization in depression. We talked about in sort of the back and forth that we had before about how
Hmm.
sometimes depression can rob you of the love of things that you enjoy doing. So,
Hmm.
painting, I mean, that happened to me this year. I had like a 3 week painting fast where I was just like I couldn't motivate myself to do it. And how much do you think that kind of ties into what you were just talking about? Is it a situational depression? Is it more of a clinical thing? Like, let's open that up a little bit.
Sure. Um, I mean, I'll say, you know, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I had my models out ready to go. And I probably looked at them 5 or 6 times that day and thought, I should pick these up and paint them. Couldn't bring myself to do it. It was too much of a chore to even kind of settle in and bother. Um, so, like I'm not perfect either, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I think the difference between like situational depression or sadness and like a clinical kind of manifestation of that, there are criteria that need to be met for clinical depression. Mostly, it's The two main things are feelings of sadness or numbness, like a lack of emotion. Often people think that it has to be like the stereotypical depression is like, I'm at home on the couch, I can't move, I can't do anything, and all I do is cry all the time. And some of that's possibly true, but it doesn't have to present as sadness. It can present as numbness, as a lack of emotion, where you just are feeling empty. Um, in addition to that, there's a feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. And then also this, it's just really hard to get anything done. Motivation disappears. There can be a lack of interest in things that brought you joy. There can be increased or decreased sleep, increased or decreased appetite or weight gain, increased irritability. You can actually be angry a lot. And these symptoms need to be present more days than not for at least a 2-week period. So if you're having a bad weekend or bad day, like that's normal. We have bad days. Life without the up and downs isn't really a full life. And actually, it's kind of important, I think, actually to be able to enjoy your sadness and to have that period of melancholy that you can really dig into and enjoy. And I know that sounds really weird, but sadness is an indicator that something matters to you, that something meant something to you, and you're mourning its loss. So there's times where that sadness matters, whether it's a sports team that didn't perform the way you wanted, or a 40K game that went the wrong way, or you went on a first date and it didn't really work out and you're bummed for a couple days because of that
Or a
date.
couple dates.
Or a couple dates, you're bummed after a couple dates. Could be any of those things, right?
Yeah. Oh, that makes
But
sense.
clinical depression is at least 2 weeks. It can be longer than that. It can be a recurrent kind of pattern, and that's really when it's something to kind of pay attention to.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things, kind of the takeaways that you and I had after our initial discussion was, how do you know when you need to get help for something? Because we have these conversations about mental health, and we talk about you know anxiety over social anxiety, things like that, or we talk about uh, imposter syndrome, or the pressures of social media and things like that. Those are all things that can occur, but that doesn't, just because you're feeling one of those things for one day doesn't mean that you need to go
Hmm.
see a psychologist right away. How does somebody, if someone's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, well, that sounds like me, how
Hmm.
what's the point where you would say you should go talk to somebody?
Well, it depends on how you want to view mental health. If you view mental health as something that like only crazy people engage in, then for that you're going to want just meds, because you're going to want a quick fix, and it's not going to really work. Um, because people who are crazy, that's really a kind of a colloquial term, and we don't really use that term in the field at all, other than to assure people that they're not crazy.
Hmm.
Um, but that's kind of the stigma that's there, is that it's only people who are really bad off that go to therapy. But um, therapy is beneficial to people kind of at any level of functioning. I work with people who are severely depressed, and it's a win when they're able to get in the office, or nowadays log on to telehealth and have the conversation. That's a win. But for other people, they just you know they're not, it's not that anything's necessarily wrong, they just, something feels off and they're not really sure what it is, and they wanted to talk to somebody about it. um, I would say that if you're thinking, maybe should I get therapy, I don't know, then maybe you should get therapy. That's a good indication. um, Therapy doesn't have to be after things are horrible and everything needs to be rebuilt. It can also be how to take your life from where it is to whatever the next level is as well. So we often treat mental health as if it's we treat mental health as if it's just mental illness, and like when you go to a doctor, you just go to the doctor when you're sick. But it can also be like going to a personal trainer, where I know how to go to the gym and I know how to work out, but I really want to take it to the next level. So let me go to someone who can help me do that and help me get out of my way so that I can show up in my life the way that I really like to.
Yeah, it helped me
Um,
get out of my way. I really like the way you put that, because when it comes to the comparisons that we make, and we've talked about this with comparing paint jobs or comparing
mhm.
conversions and things like that, really the only person you should be comparing yourself to is yourself. So you are the one who needs to get out of your way to get the help that you need. But with that in
Mhm.
mind, now sometimes you don't recognize the need for help in yourself, or
Right.
maybe your friend, you have a friend who is struggling and you feel like they need to get help and you don't know how to approach them about that. How would you recommend that a concerned friend looking out for somebody else in their close proximity, a hobby buddy, a insert whatever connection you want here? What's the best way to go about talking to someone about, or well, having the conversations like, hey, have you thought about seeing somebody?
Well, I think it's one of those things where it's just better to kind of blunder into it than not. People often have a misunderstanding that talking about these issues makes them worse. It's one of the things that people are terrified to talk about, to talk to someone who's suicidal about their suicidal thoughts and about their suicidal plans. But the truth is, if you talk to someone about suicide, they're actually less likely to attempt suicide. Um, and the people who are most successful at completing suicide are the ones that don't talk to anybody about it. So if someone's talking about what's happening, it's best to just kind of blunder into it and try to get them to do what they can to get help. I said earlier, just take medication, but I think there's a role for medication. I don't think medication is necessarily the whole story. I wouldn't do what I do if I did think that. But sometimes medication is the thing that gets you over the hump. Sometimes being on an antidepressant medication for 6 months or a year or even 2 years is what's really needed to kind of get you to start to get that motivation to put your life in order. For some forms of mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that requires constant medication to kind of manage and maintain. And so those you do need medication for your whole life. But most mental illness is more like, I would say, like the flu, or an infection, rather than like diabetes. If you have diabetes, you're on medication for your whole life, and that's just the way it's going to be. If you have like type 1 diabetes, but if you get an ear infection, you take an antibiotic for a little bit, it runs its course. You're able to kind of beat it off, and defeat the infection, and then you're back to normal life again. And sometimes an antidepressant medication will be that sort of a thing. Sometimes an anti-anxiety medication will be the same sort of thing. You're struggling with things that are kind of overwhelming in the moment, and you just need a little medicinal help to kind of get you through. For the difference, though, with therapy is that we're able to kind of, rather than treat the symptoms, we're able to kind of unlock and uncover the roots of the problems, and that's where you kind of see real change. So, um, yeah, I think asking someone, it's easier here in Southern California, I think, uh, because and often in other places in the United States, at least, a common phrase, especially on a Sunday afternoon, is like, well, my preacher said, or the pastor said today, or the minister said today, and that's something that kind of people keep throughout the week, where they're able to kind of reference, what their spiritual advisor, their spiritual mentor, kind of talks to them about. Here in Southern California, it's not uncommon to say, "Well, my therapist said." I think there's actually various Twitter handles and Facebook pages and Instagram pages that it's stuff my therapist said, where it'll kind of go through just various responses. And there's there's also, it's just something that comes up in common language here. So here in Southern California, talking about getting a therapist is something that's pretty quick and easy, and pretty part of the culture. In other places where it might not be, um, you know, I think just broaching the subject and being able to ask, like, if you thought about talking to a professional about this, and there may be some resistance to that, but one of the benefits of therapy, and I know this because I've done therapy. I do therapy for a living, but I've been in my own therapy before. And as you were mentioning, Chris, that you were in therapy before. I think that the benefit of therapy is that you're with someone who doesn't have to treat you the way anybody else does. And the relationship that you develop with your therapist is different than any other relationship because they they don't have the same obligations, and they're there just for you, and they're there. It's a one-way relationship where the therapist is there for you. You don't have to be there for the therapist.
Yeah. And one of the things that kind of, since we're talking about the relationship between people and their therapists, I think that it's important to talk about, like, if you are going to see one, it's so critical to be honest, like as honest as you know how to
Hmm.
be. And that doesn't even mean that maybe you know everything about what's going wrong with you. That's kind of what you're there
Hmm.
to unpack. It's goes back to getting out of your own way, because sometimes
Hmm.
you don't realize where you've been missing until
Hmm.
you actually say it out loud. And the conversation, and this is one of the things I love the most about therapy, it's also one of the reasons I overshare way too much with all of my friends and my wife and everybody, is that talking about things helps me figure them out.
Yeah.
And it can be intimidating to try and talk about things nowadays, because it always feels like, especially in the age of social media, somebody's watching, and maybe you'll say the incorrect idea and it will bring about the hate and the swarms of the internet trolls from their dark, murky bridges.
Right.
And maybe you're just trying to figure something out. Like, you're free from that with a therapist. You can be honest, and if you want to really solve the problem, I think you have to be.
Hmm. And I think, you know, the way that I practice it, having people talk at length and say the wrong thing that they didn't intend that actually is the truth. That's a special moment. And yeah, I'm not here to be the thought police. In fact, I don't necessarily. There's a few things that'll be exceptions, of course, but I don't necessarily care what people believe. It's not my job to make them think anything or believe anything. I'm not here to change their mind to match mine. I'm here to help them understand what they think and what they're doing well, and understand the patterns of their lives that have brought them to this place. Some of which are actually really good because they wouldn't have gotten to where they are if it wasn't for those patterns that now aren't working quite the way they wanted to.
And sometimes it's the failures that create those opportunities as well. The
Hmm.
opportunities to overcome or to pivot and relook at the way you were doing things. Now, just before we kind of close out this part of it, I want to ask one other thing: is how would you address somebody who is worried about not doing something, or who feels like they have to take ownership for somebody else's suffering? When, or they feel responsible if if somebody did go too far in self-harm, and you feel responsible for them. Maybe I should have looked out for them more. Like, do you have anything, any advice you would say to somebody like that?
I would say that there's only so much that you can do for someone. Um, we have things that are put in place to try to prevent people from harming themselves or harming others. In fact, therapy in general, at least in California, and it should be this way everywhere, ethically. I don't know if it's this way everywhere legally because I'm not a legal expert. But the concept of confidentiality means that like anything that people share with me, I'm not going to share with anyone else. So like, even if you were to ask me about like who I'm seeing or clients or anything like that, I'll never reveal information about an individual client that anyone would be able to identify or people like, oh, I know that's Timmy. Yeah. Um, so like that's just not something that happens. and all that information is private. But however, there are exceptions to that, and the exceptions are basically if somebody's going to get hurt. So one of those is if you say you're going to hurt yourself, or if you're going to hurt somebody else, then we have to intervene on that behalf. Here in California, that's called a 5150, and that's where you can put somebody in the hospital against their will to try to keep them safe. I've also worked in those facilities, and I know that there's different levels of keeping people safe. There's the level where you check on them every 15 minutes. There's the level where you have one person who sits with them every moment of every day to make sure they're okay. And then there's the last level where they actually are, in a special room and they're chemically restrained. And because you're not allowed to physically restrain people anymore, which is a good thing. But they're on medication to make it so that they don't hurt themselves. And even with all those things, people can still successfully complete suicide. And so, if all of the professionals who have all the tools to try to keep people alive can't do it, then your typical civilian on the street that has no background in mental health should not feel responsible at all if they've done everything that they can do to try to help that person.
I think
It's
that's,
okay.
yeah, I
You're
appreciate
going to
what you have
feel
to say
sad
about
about
it.
it. You're going to feel sad about it. And it's okay to feel devastated when someone you care about hurts themselves in either a permanent or non permanent manner. Someone ending their lives and you feel like you should have done something different. Like, yeah, I get that. You're going to have to sit with that. It's going to feel bad. But, at the end of the day, I would hope that you wouldn't continue to feel responsibility for that. And instead, you could just feel sad that the person you cared about is gone.
I think that's great advice. I appreciate you talking about that. I tend to agree. And sometimes I particularly know what it's like to just kind of feel too responsible for someone else's happiness. And
Mm-hmm.
I think on some level we all do that to varying degrees. But when you think about very few people actually can make somebody else commit suicide,
Mm-hmm.
and even fewer can do it without trying.
Right.
Um, and I think that you should. The first thing is taking ownership for yourself and the things that are under your control, but that also means excluding yourself from things that are outside of your control. Those are things that you have to deal with, but those aren't things that you have to own.
Right.
So that's awesome. Well, thanks so much for talking about that. I mean, I know that's heavy stuff, and we just got done talking about like self harm, suicide, chemical restraints, things like that. That's stuff. I want to bring it in now and talk about a couple of the questions that I got from our last article, and
Sure.
these are completely anonymous on here. Not going to name any names, uh, but I really enjoyed this first one, and the question goes as follows. Uh, I have played games where a particularly devastating blow has negatively affected my opponent's mental state. When that happens to me, I try to take a breather, maybe go get a drink and rally myself. But I feel like telling an opponent that maybe they should take a break might be taken the wrong way. Do you have recommendations for how to help an opponent for whom the current match is detectably having a negative impact on them? This could be reworded as how to rally your squad mate when summary execution is the last resort.
Hmm. Well, I think this would fit. Part of this would fit into the category of, take ownership of the things that are yours, and as you just said, only being responsible for your own happiness and not someone else's. That said, part of the, it's not your job to cheer up your opponent when you wipe their favorite squad that didn't get to do anything. No, they just finished painting up their new knight, and you
Nahumck
won.
syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the very first time they took it out on the field, and all of a sudden you did what you're supposed to do, and you took it off the board first turn, so it couldn't do anything, and they're all bummed about it, and there goes their whole plan. Um, I think that's inevitable, and I think part of it is not, you don't have to feel bad for them. You can feel bad with them. and I think that'll kind of help things along. Um, as I'm thinking it through, I'm thinking of like an opportunity would be maybe you take a little pause from that game, and if you're at like a gaming store that has like soda, or if it's someplace that if you and your opponent both are of legal age to drink and do partake in drinking, maybe like, do you want to like take a minute? I'll get you a beer or something like that. There's things that you can do to kind of like diffuse it. Um, but I think like mentioning like, oh, that sucks, you know, and then moving on is probably the best thing to do, because I think that's helpful. The other thing, sometimes people just at that point, it's not going to happen in a tournament necessarily, but if it's a friendly game, you can just like, all right, well, why don't we re-back and start again? Or you can encourage them like, well, let's play it out and see what happens if you don't have that. Let's see what would have happened. Um, I think as I'm talking, I'm wondering if any of this is helpful. Um,
I mean, I,
hmm,
I I imagine a lot of it will depend on the situation, and some of why that person is frustrated. I mean, it could have nothing to do with what's going on at the table,
that's
but
true.
so there's a lot of if going on here. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's I think we kind of take that for granted. It does remind me of a game I had about 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. I was playing a game of 30K at the Las Vegas Open,
Hmm.
and I remember my opponent. We had a match where the rolls went my way. I had a pretty good strategy, and the combination of the two meant that after the second turn, it wasn't looking so good for him. So
Hmm.
what we did is we ended the game early, and then I took him over to the bar and I got him a drink, and we sat down and we just started talking to each other. And he was from Australia, and that was interesting. And of course,
Hmm.
I was American, so he would complain to me about how expensive things are in Australia.
Oh yeah.
And fair enough. I just I remember that was a really good opportunity and not even to say that he was really upset about anything that was going on, but it was a really good human connection moment. And maybe that's the takeaway from this is that, there's an opportunity for connection. Maybe it won't be, lots of maybes, lots of ifs, but,
Hmm.
we can at least uh, reach out in a human way. And maybe moving on is the best answer. You'll kind of have to feel that out. And the best way to do that, I think, is to communicate.
Well, and I think we do this because it's a social activity to have fun with other people. Is there a competitive thing? Yes. Do we want to win? Yes. But there are very small selection of people who are really in the running to be the best at this. And if I went to LVO and was going to play in the 40K championship, like I would feel happy going 50-50. That would be like a good showing for me. I'm not going to win the whole thing. And I know that going in, so that's not my aim. And I think then the point is just to have a good game with somebody else and to enjoy that time, because it's not life and death. Most of us aren't making any money. In fact, we're spending money playing these games, and that's what they are. They're games. They're supposed to help us engage and give us a common language and connection to make it easier to connect.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. That actually leads really nicely into the next one that has to do with introversion, extroversion, and social anxiety. Talking
Mm.
about going out and playing games and people who resist that. So, do you think that there is an exposure therapy way to approach someone who has a hard time coming out to a store and playing with a club?
Yeah, there's a couple different things that you can definitely do. Exposure therapy, for those who don't know, is where you slowly work to desensitize yourself to whatever is anxiety provoking by being around it longer. I think on YouTube actually there's some pretty interesting videos of people who've done exposure therapy. There's one with exposure therapy with balloons. Um, this 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 mother who wants to throw a birthday party for her young son is afraid of balloons because of some reason when she was younger. And so at the beginning, she's very terrified of balloons. And at the end, she's playing with the balloons and having a good time and popping them and having fun. So it's a good example of kind of what exposure therapy would look like, kind of in a more clinical setting. In your average everyday life, if you're feeling this kind of social anxiety, there's a couple of different things that you can do. Anxiety happens when we don't feel safe. Anxiety is literally like a response to a threat in the environment. Um, with that, our our internal systems that work to make us feel that anxiety they were built on very old structures that we share in common with other animals. It goes back to actually lizards, and lizards aren't very social creatures, not in the way that like higher mammals are. And so our initial response when it first developed was to physical threats to our safety and well-being. And as we developed our social capacities, those social threats got layered onto the same system. So the way you feel when you're in a social setting and it feels threatening in those ways, you respond the same way you would if there was like a lion in the room. Um, and so the easiest way to kind of disarm that is to take away the threat. If you're having trouble at a club and you're not really sure who to interact with, um, if you know whoever's kind of in charge of the game and setting up the games, I would try to talk to them. If you're not good with face to face, typically you can reach out through. I know a lot of people have Facebook groups now where they'll set up games and make plans. You can reach out there to find out who the kind of league TO is, and then reach out to them and find out maybe who they can pair you up with. It would be a good game, kind of ease you in. They'll also be really good at giving you advice of the people to kind of avoid, because not every gaming store is good about policing itself. And sometimes there are people who are just, they're not any fun to play. Or they're not the person that you want to play if you're trying to get somebody into the hobby for the first time or get somebody connected with the league. League organizers know this, and they'll often kind of steer you in the right direction. If you're in a place though that you've managed to make it in on game night and you've got your opponent and you're ready to go, um, something that can help is to make it less confrontational between the two of you and make it a shared experience. So um, this is where mindfulness practices are going to be very helpful. And some of the easy mindfulness is all about bringing yourself into the moment rather than kind of being distracted by your worries and your thoughts. And ways that you can do that are kind of be very intentional about kind of noticing what the terrain looks like. Look at their army, look at their, what colors they use for stuff. Did they paint the eyes of their models? Did they get, uh, you know, the 3D printed chapter badges that they put on the shoulder pads, or did they use decals, or did they freehand those? Those are the kind of things that you can kind of pay attention to that'll help distract you from your own anxiety and kind of get you more immersed in the game uh, in front of you as it is. You can ask them questions about their armies, like what made them want to play it, like you know what kind of battles have they had, like what was the last game that they played, how did they do. um, all those sorts of things are going to help smooth things out and reduce that social anxiety because you're going to make it more of a friendly sort of interaction. The other thing to remember is that it's okay to be a little shy. It's okay to be a little standoffish. Um, most people are nervous in social situations for the first couple of minutes until they loosen up. If it takes you 15, that's okay. But you will eventually get over that hump. And the last thing, really, to say with that is that um, it's important to remember that um, when you attend these things, you're supposed to be having fun. And if it turns out to not be the group for you, then it's okay to find your own group. That's why Garage Hammer is so much fun for people, is because they get to be really picky and choosy about who they play with. Not everybody can do that. I recognize that. But, you shouldn't have to play a game against somebody who you don't want to play.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to bring up so far as like you you don't have to play at the club to be a worthwhile member of the hobby community. It's not all about going out to places and doing things. I just bring it up because the more the merrier, right? Generally speaking,
Hmm.
we want people to feel like they can if if that's what they want. And what I at least what I understand about exposure therapy is that the people who are doing exposure therapy, they are agreeing to it and they're setting their own boundaries,
Hmm.
and they have the freedom to pull back when they're no longer in that sort of growth zone, when things
Right.
go too far. And so I would just kind of add to people who are maybe trying to bring their introverted friend in, don't throw them a surprise party and say exposure therapy, you're good now, look at all these people, you're here, you're trapped. That's when that old animal instinct's going to kick in. You're like, I'm in a room full of lions. And
Right.
it's important that whoever it is, if you are trying to get somebody who is nervous about going around people, make sure they're aware of what's going on and make sure they're okay with it first. Like, you can't force someone to like something, and in fact you're probably only going to make it worse if you try that way.
Yeah. Actually, it's not TSR anymore. Wizards of the Coast with D&D. I think they're the ones that did it. There's a thing that's been released lately that's consent in gaming, and it's a really interesting document that looks at um, consent in terms of what people are okay with and what they're not okay with at all levels of interaction with the game.
I
And I
think I've
think
seen that.
those, yeah, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, it's more free form. You can do similar sorts of things. I've played Dark Heresy games and Rogue Trader games, the role playing game. I think it's Wrath and Glory is the uh,
Yeah, I think that's
current,
the new one. Yeah.
and I've never played that before. But if you're playing a role playing game and you're playing it in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, it is grim and dark and creepy and nasty, and life sucks. And it's not a world that anyone would actually want to be in. And if they actually really wanted to be in that, I would have some questions about whether or not they really understood the setting. But if you're going to play in that setting, there still are things that I think it's worth kind of talking about, and I think it's part of the social contract. And I think that document for Wizards of the Coast was more about being more um, uh, transparent and more intentional about how we're setting up the social contract between the people who are playing at the table. And I think that matters um, for 40K and tabletop gaming. And a lot of the social contract is taken care of. I mean, when the ITC had their own mission pack, you know the mission rules and the tournament rules were kind of having that initial conversation that the book says to have beforehand for you. But there probably are some things that the community could do better as far as setting those expectations, to make things happen so that we're on the same page. And that can be something as far as like, this is going to be a fun game. And, like, I don't have everything, I'm trying to work on a list, so I don't really know what's going to happen. Or I've got a tournament next weekend that I'm trying to do well at. So I need you to bring your hardest list, and I need you to play play me as competitively as possible for this game. Those sorts of things are conversations that are important. And I think if you're someone who's shy and who's dealing with that social anxiety, there are going to be a lot of tools within the community to be able to help you navigate that so that you can have the experience that you want. And if it turns out that, you know, the group that you're playing with, they eat apples and you prefer to have oranges, then go with the group that does oranges. That's okay. And I think that's like 15 different metaphors. So,
We'll see. Let's not turn that into a drinking game when it comes to talking about philosophy and psychology. How many metaphors? How many drinks?
yes,
We wouldn't want to put anybody in the hospital. Well,
no.
but I really like what you had to say about that, and again, just it's really nice to kind of discuss these things openly. And now we've gone through a couple of these questions. I'm afraid I didn't have more. I would love to have more and just keep shooting them off at you and seeing how long we can get these answers and how many how many metaphors we can add to the pile. Uh, I have just kind of to close us out something that's a little bit more on the lighthearted side, something a little fun. I have a scenario
Sure.
for you. So,
Okay.
okay, so this father comes in, and he has he has 18 sons that all have problems, but he doesn't know what they are, and he's trying to turn himself around to be a good father. We're going to go through and diagnose some of these children. Are you game for that?
Okay. Yeah, but it's actually 21 sons, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. Right. I guess. This father apparently isn't so good at counting, but yeah, in in no particular order, let's go down and let's diagnose the Primarchs. What do you say?
I think we can do that. Although I have to be honest, it is unethical for me to diagnose someone who I haven't actually done any work with. However, as these are fictional characters, I'm sure we can come up with fictional diagnoses.
Of course. And of course this is all sort of this is all just fun. We aren't trying to I would definitely put a disclaimer out that we're not trying to minimize anybody's struggle if they end up having the same problems as some of these people. On the flip side, I would just say look what all you can accomplish even despite your problems relating to some of these characters. How's that for a good spin?
Well, if you look in history, Abraham Lincoln, Churchill, both suffered from serious bouts of depression through most of their lives. Leonardo da Vinci, it's pretty clear that he had bipolar disorder. So, mental illness does not mean that you can't live a full and not just useful life, but also a life that's meaningful and has value to yourself as well as others. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Come
if we're
in.
being honest, I
Yeah.
mean, the emperor is a little bit of a narcissist. So,
I think if his sons are all a part of him, then he's a part of all mental illnesses.
yes.
Speaking as a the Inquisition's knocking on my door right now for that, but as a diehard loyalist, I mean, honesty, man, he's got some problems,
Yeah.
especially with emotion. But so I'm gonna go down the list. I just kind of typed them all out. I didn't put them in order because I was just doing it from memory. Part of that was kind of a
Sure.
little challenge to myself. So we're just gonna go in no particular order. Sorry for all
Sure.
of those people who like to see things done numerically, but some of those numbers get skipped anyway. So too bad. Let's start with Alfarius Omegon.
um, well, I mean, clearly multiple personalities, right?
Multiple personalities. Yep, I think that's fair. Uh,
and a high degree of paranoia.
Yeah, paranoia is a good one for that too. I was saving that one for someone else, but I think it definitely applies. Um, that's good. Let's move on. Rogel Dorn.
I mean, he's hard because he's just like so incredibly stubborn. But stubbornness is not necessarily a mental illness. So, um,
How about something like obsessive compulsive? Would he be kind of a compulsive character? Like,
um, well, in the common parlance, he would totally fit that. But as far as like the clinical definition, he does not. He wouldn't meet that because he's not engaging in compulsive behaviors to deal with his obsessive thoughts. So
okay,
um, it also, and maybe this is the loyalist to me, uh, some of them are just written to be like conflicted characters that don't have mental illness, and those tend to be the loyalists. Whereas those that fell, there's a reason they fell,
mm,
and it's because uh, the Dark Four happen to prey upon those weaknesses and kind of turn them to their advantage. So
naturally,
I
yeah.
I would say though, like there is a little bit of borderline personality to Rogel Dorn in his black and white thinking and all or nothing kind of interactions with people. And
Ah,
once you fail
yeah.
him, you're just kind of done. So
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that, but it makes total sense now that you said it out loud. No, I mean, and everyone's kind of used to like the joke dorn, which is
mhm,
um, building a pillow fort, and no traitors allowed, that kind of thing.
mhm.
But really, like he does, and he does that to himself too. After the heresy's over, he's just punishes himself so hard for his perceived failure. This is why this is fun for me. Okay. Um, well, and because I wrote Dorn, I had to write this one after, because that's the way this relationship I think will always be. Perturabo.
Perturabo. He seems to have like an inferiority complex.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Uh,
Um,
he he's just always like, I don't know. Like I also think of him, and maybe this is more of a biblical reference, but I think of him as like the brother of the prodigal son. You know,
yeah,
like
yeah.
we're like, I'm always doing the right thing, and I always do what you tell me, and you never like me, you never thank me, so I'm going to betray you. Okay.
Yeah, I can see that. I kind of looked at Perturabo myself, and I thought he had sort of a vulnerable narcissism,
Yeah, I can see that too. Absolutely.
where he just kind of sits in his brother's basement, I guess you could say, and just thinks about how why doesn't the world bow to his whim? If he was in charge of everything, it would be going well, and you know that sort of a thing. That's kind of my take on it.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Awesome. Well, on the subject of narcissists, Horace Lupercal. What do you think of what do you think is wrong with Horace?
Um, I think the thing that's wrong with Horus is he was stabbed by a chaos weapon. Although,
That hurts. That's something that
yeah,
happened to him, sure. Yeah.
yeah. No, I think, to be honest, I've never really been happy with the way they've kind of presented Horus because it didn't seem there's something missing in the tale, and part of it's because they're trying to fit the old narrative, but I never felt like it was developed as well as it could have been um, for Horus. But he's the again, I don't know if this is mental illness, but he's like the most popular kid in high school that like finds out his dad has. I don't even. I want to rephrase that. He's the most popular kid in high school that that thinks he's found evidence that his dad has a whole secret life with a different family, and he becomes so angry about it without ever really verifying that that's true.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, and I kind of agree with you. There's a little bit of underdevelopment when it comes to Horace, and as I've been writing the philosophy series on Frontline, and I have been looking at that from a variety of different sources, and I found that a lot of like Horace's mentality is actually in the Horus Heresy Black books from Forge World. It talks about it a lot, just like his desire to be the best, and
Mm-hmm.
his jealousy of others, particularly one great winged angel person. Um, but he was very jealous. But the thing in the first trilogy, like I think it was the second book, False Gods,
Mm-hmm.
I think is what it was called, that stood out to me was, and spoiler warning for everybody, I will just throw that out there. These books have been out for over a decade now.
Yeah.
But spoiler alert, there's this moment where Magnus and my least favorite word bearer, Erebus, are trying
Mm-hmm.
to convince Horus to go one way or the other, to take a deal from the Chaos Gods and live, or to not, and to let himself pass away. And he eventually tells both of them to shove it, to shut up, and that
Mm-hmm.
he's going to make a decision, but that he's going to make it for himself because of what he feels like he deserves. And that to me was kind of like the biggest, like, oh, this is the real Horus. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't even care at this point that he may be being lied to by Erebus. That's just kind of an excuse for him to have what he really wants, an excuse to be the one. So I kind of looked at him as more of a more of a borderline in that respect. Um,
Yeah, I can see that.
to begin with, but I don't disagree with your assessment either. This is fun. um, okay, so we'll switch back to a loyalist, and I'll offer my opinion on this first. Uh, my Primarch Sanguinius. I think he's got a bit of imposter syndrome, and you mentioned I may have brought this up earlier, but you mentioned you thought that that was actually a good thing. Um,
Yes.
I also think
Well,
he's got anger management issues.
probably, probably. Yeah. I mean, they don't call it the black rage for no reason. Um, but I think uh, I think I agree with that. Imposter syndrome is one of those things that is a healthy part of gaining expertise. Um, but it can get to a point where it's crippling, and it prevents you from actually being able to do the thing that you should be able to do. Um, and so it's just a lot of that second guessing and being unsure, and you know, part of that too is I think the fact that he's got wings, and like, I'm a mutant, but I'm also like revered as being the most beautiful, and that's a weird dichotomy. So
Yeah,
yeah,
he's complicated. They're all
he is.
complicated.
Yes.
But yeah, I tend to agree, and I find Sanguinius to be relatable on many levels. It's one of the reasons I stick with that Legion so much. I'll spare everyone from my bloviating fanboying overly much, but um, that idea also that the rage was just kind of his internal frustration over how unfair and how awful things were when they could have been so good, and knowing that knowing what he's going to be and just how that builds up over time is like, man, that feeling is just really relatable to me. So
Hmm.
yeah, we'll leave that at that. Um, and then on the other side of the pretty coin, depending on how you like it, uh, Fulgrim. What would you say about Fulgrim?
I mean, he's also like a obviously a hedonist, and which isn't necessarily a mental illness, but he's a narcissist, and seems like a psychopath actually. Um, we the current editions of the DSM don't look at like sadism or masochism as mental illnesses anymore, although they can be harmful. But yeah, he's totally a sadist and a masochist and a psychopath who doesn't really care about anything beyond himself.
Yeah, that was kind of where grandiose narcissism, where that comes in, was, at least to me, as I saw Fulgrim, his grand fantasies about himself, and just the way that he kind of over he's overblown his own importance and beauty, and
Hmm.
I I just honestly I can't stand him. But um but there's something about that where it's just to love yourself to that point. Hmm. So many
Yeah.
people just have so many problems hating themselves, and I think what is the saying that intelligent people are more likely to be depressed because they can more easily look at themselves and see what's wrong.
Well, I mean, that's why philosophically, you know, the philosophical term for a pessimist is a realist. So,
Yeah,
you
so
know,
to me that just says Fulgrim's not that smart. But
no,
but moving on, we'll go with his poor brother who lost his head, Ferris Manus. What would you say about him?
he's one of those guys that also wasn't around all that often. Um, he definitely seems to be fairly rigid and very stuck in his ways, very demanding and fierce. But also, I mean, I'll be honest, the Iron Hands were not the uh, not the easiest ones to read through in the Horus Heresy. although I think his name was Shadrach. He was fun to read about.
Yeah, Medusan was driven. He was cool.
Um, but I think I don't know. It's one of those he didn't really feature that much, and he was just kind of angry. I didn't really get a read for him at all. He
Hmm.
was
I think that's fair. I mean, yeah, he was cut off, so to speak, fairly early in the series. I kind of fixated a little bit on the hands, how they would cut off one of their hands, and it
hmm
reminded me of it's basically like a body dissociation sort of thing. There are people who, if and correct me if I'm wrong on this, who think that they're born with somebody else's hand, and they feel a desire to, it's like, this isn't my hand, I have to get rid of it, like
yeah, false limb syndrome.
false limb, that's it, which is different from like ghost limb, where
hmm
your arm or leg gets cut off and it still feels like it's there. It's like, no, this doesn't feel like it's mine, I have to get rid of it. And
Right.
something about that with his sort of liquid metal hands just kind of stood out to me. I don't know if that really fits or not, but that's kind of, because there's not a whole lot about him. That's kind of where I got stuck into it. I don't know.
Yeah,
He's a tough nut to crack.
he is, and that's probably the closest we'll be able to get to him, unless they talk more about his background.
Well, with that in mind, let's talk Mortarion.
Oh, in a weird way, I think he's really an addict.
An addict.
Yeah, like an addict with an intense amount of self-loathing. It starts with him, like the thing that's giving him problems and the thing that kept him down was the thing that kind of protected his his master, which was that poisonous fog and filth and whatnot. And
Right.
and then he just kind of kept it around and kind of leaned into it and embraced it. And that would be the kind of thing that he would share with his sons when he was reunited with them. And then he hated the warp. And then after he got to a point where I want to learn more about this. I want to learn more. He still hates the warp and he still hates magic and sorcery, but he's a powerful sorcerer now.
Yeah.
So
He's literally exactly everything he says he hates.
yeah, and and he can't get away from it. So I would say, yeah, he's an addict.
That's fair. I like that. I didn't have anything picked out for him. I mean, there was a lot of internal contradiction with Mortarion, and they've been
hmm
building on that quite a bit. I haven't read it yet, but there's a recent book with a confrontation between Gilliman and Mortarion, where Gilliman just kind of calls him out on it, and Mortarion just kind of is aghast at the accusation that there's something wrong with, or inconsistent with what he's doing. It's very interesting to hear about it, but oh, that's cool. Well, the next one I want to talk about, and this one I think is the hardest. I'm going to throw that out there. This is the hardest one to pin down, and I'm going to go
Okay.
with, there's this line that Magnus did nothing wrong, which I think is very wrong, and you're a Lehman Russ fan, so I assume you would agree with that. But really, Angron did nothing wrong, is what I think the truth is. Angron is the next on the list.
Oh yeah. Um, I mean, anger management problems, of course. Um, One of the things I like that some of the authors have done is look at Angron as actually empathy, and he was the most empathic of the bunch, but he went to the wrong place, and it got warped and twisted and undone. And so he could have actually been one of the most compassionate of the Primarchs, but the nails ruined him.
Yeah, that's kind of
And
how I feel about it too. I mean, who would he have been without the nails? Like that is a question that I think only recently people have started to really seriously ask. I've seen some videos on YouTube, like in my
mhm.
recommended videos, pop up about it. I haven't watched them yet, just because I wanted to kind of suss it out for myself. But Like he's really a victim in all this, and even in turning into a demon prince, he was a victim
Yeah,
because that was something that happened to him and not something that he chose for himself.
right.
And gosh, I just way to go, Aaron Dembski Bowden, for making the Rage Machine just the most pitiable character in the Horus Heresy. Like, slow clap for that.
He's
I
just
had to
so good at
really
writing
think
that
about
stuff.
this. Yeah,
Yeah,
cool. Well,
yeah.
any other thoughts on Angron before we move on?
Um, yeah, I just think he's really tragic. He needs a hug.
He does a very violent hug, um, just so that he can actually enjoy it. Uh, all right, the next one on the list, I'm sure he's your favorite, Lion L. Johnson.
This is gonna be weird. Um, but when I read Lionel, I actually pick up some slight autism in
Really?
that, yeah, because he doesn't, there's this weird interaction he has with other people where he's kind of missing. He doesn't pay attention to the normal cues that other people do. Um, and one of the hallmarks of autism is it's difficult to look at people in the eye. It's difficult to read um, facial features and social cues and those sorts of things. And it's not that he's incapable of doing it and then he hasn't learned. It's just the way he does is just kind of off. And so that's the thing that kind of struck out to me. He's also super secretive and paranoid as well. But
Yeah, paranoia
um,
is that. This was the guy who I was thinking paranoid
mhm.
was a good descriptor for it. But yeah, I mean,
but yeah,
huh?
autism is he's someone who like also like Severus. Um, is Severus the name? I can't remember now. The Night Lord, uh,
Sevatar.
Sevatar. Thank you, Sevatar.
There we
Also
go.
strikes me as someone who's kind of on the spectrum. Um, so that's an interesting sort of thing. But
Huh.
it's also one of those things I think that representation matters. There's in the Marvel universe, there's lots of kids who are and adults that are on the spectrum that look at like Drax and they're like, he's like me, and there's something about that that's positive and good.
Hmm.
So
That's interesting. It totally caught me off on that one, but I guess that's why you're the expert and I'm the amateur. So uh, that's cool. That's gonna completely change the way that I look at that character reading him going forward. There's actually a new Lionel Johnson book that's either come out just barely or is coming out. His Primarch novel. So
mhm.
now I'm gonna see if I can. Hmm. You gave me something to think about. Okay, moving on. Um, Rabute Gilliman is next on the list.
he I don't know. I mean, he is a bit of a hypocrite,
Naturally.
but they all are, especially when we get to my guy. But I think his whole thing is he's like he's the one that's always trying to make it up to daddy. He's the one that's always trying to like make daddy proud, um, because he feels inferior, and he's never really sure it's going to be enough.
I also kind of see him as, and I don't know if this is a mental illness per se, but he always feels like he knows best and it should be done his way. Um, he's always looking at a system that someone else creates and thinking, "Oh, I'm going to play with that and I'm going to make it better." Um,
Mm,
and I don't know what that would represent necessarily, but it's this obsession with improving things. But a lot of those ideas aren't necessarily his. He kind of builds off of them and
that's true.
takes credit for them.
I can see that.
Yeah,
Um,
they built that into his Legion rules too, to a certain extent. They're like one of his special units was actually based off of Perturabo's special unit. And it's just like here's here's this entire unit of Typhoon Terminators, and we made them better by giving them more guns. Like take this idea and push it further.
yeah, and
So
we have yet to see what he does in the. I mean, he basically did that with the Primaris Marines, right?
yeah,
So,
Marine but better,
hmm
except in armor design. um, okay, well, let's move on from Gilliman and go to um, one of the more complicated philosophical characters in my mind. And I know you are not a super huge fan, but Conrad Kurz.
mm. Yeah, I would say schizophrenia would be his situation. I think he's an interesting character, and he's not wrong. He just
He's
he's
crazy.
yeah, he's just crazy. He classically. I mean, we don't use this term anymore, but classically paranoid schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting to see him up next to Sanguinius because they both have this premonition of their own death, right?
hmm
And the way that each of them kind of deals with that. Now,
hmm
Sanguinius gets angry and he kind of suppresses that anger, and he gets to unleash it on a few bad guys during the Horus Heresy, which is nice to watch. Uh, but then you have someone like Kurz who's just kind of obsessed with that's the way it must be,
hmm
and he's kind of given up before he started. And I mean that's also a little tragic. I mean, we look at Angron. Angron was put through something and things happened to him to make him the way he was. But Conrad Kurz seemed to me to have these problems and then to kind of double down on them. Uh,
hmm
to like it's like he lost that battle with himself over why living mattered.
Well, there's three responses to knowing what your doom is, like being told this is how you end, right? And in Sanguinus we see one, in Conrad we see another, and no one showed us the third. So, you know,
It's probably one of the missing Primarchs. We just didn't get to see
yeah, well,
it.
maybe, but there's what Sanguinus does, which is like this is when I die, and so if I don't die until then, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure things are okay, and that I don't leave a mess behind. And and you actually see him like going around and taking insane risks because like, well, I already know how I die and it's not here, so I'm going to do what I can to help people. Like this isn't where I die, so I'm going to be heroic. um Kurz, he's like, I know when I die, so nothing I do matters, and so I'm just going to lean into being lecherous and mean and horrible and rotten to everyone.
Yeah, he's kind of nihilism incarnate.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have feelings about nihilism, but because it's funny. There's a page I follow on Facebook. It's nihilist memes, and it's to me it's kind of a comedy page, which sounds
hmm
really depressing, but it's one of those things where they just go on and complain about how useless life is and stuff like that, and it's just so alien to the way that I look at things that it
hmm
kind of seems almost silly and funny to me. But I also understand like when you especially if you read old philosophy. I mean, you read any Russian philosopher, and you'll
Yeah.
understand that nihilism is something that is just like when you abandon certain precepts and you just really think about how things are. I can understand it. Like I get how people get to that point. Uh, and Kurz is kind of that for me because I
hmm
I get him, but I also really don't.
Right.
He's fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Next up, this one was very hard for me because I really think that this character is fairly developed. or individuated would be the way that I would put it. Um,
Hmm.
Jagged Eye Khan.
Um, he surprisingly, I think, very, very antisocial.
Antisocial.
So
Okay.
because I mean, he's tight with his people, but he doesn't really want to have anything to do with anybody else. And so, yeah, I'd say like antisocial personality disorder.
Huh. Antisocial. I can see that. I mean, I kind of thought he was pretty introverted. Um,
Yeah,
but like, hmm, eh, hmm. Okay, so
and
you
it,
made me think about it again.
yeah, and and again, like it's weird because it's not within his legion, but it absolutely is like. So this is where maybe mental disorder is the wrong way to talk about it, but besides the fact that he's the based on the Mongolian way of and the Khans, they use the word Khan, and their whole thing was like my empire is everything that's underneath the sky, so they don't recognize any borders, and it's just all mine. You know,
Hmm.
he's not really that. He's more like the hippies that are just like you can take your whole empire and just like do whatever, man. I'm gonna do my own thing, and okay, it seems to work for him. It just makes him, you know, people don't. It's more people don't trust him because they don't know where he's at. They don't know where he stands.
Hmm. I mean that's true. He was one of the big enigmas
Hmm.
during the heresy, and then he just pieced out somewhere into the webway, and we don't know what happened since, which is frustrating because he's so interesting to me.
Hmm.
And I like what you brought up with the Mongols and things, but like when you look at his one of the things I saw in common between him and the way that the Mongols are written about, uh, I, I definitely recommend Hardcore Histories, Wrath of the
Absolutely.
Khans,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and that's where I'm getting kind of this opinion from. But they also kind of looked at themselves as the judges and the scourges of sin and God's wrath upon the earth.
Hmm.
And Khan himself kind of took that role on his home planet, and he also talked about it quite a bit after, where he was just like, empires become corrupt, and I'm here to upset that corruption. And I always thought that that was kind of almost a really developed way of thinking about the way that systems tend to crumble and need to be
Hmm.
upset, and the pieces put back together. And sometimes that means cutting out something. Obviously we're not advocating everyone get on horses and ride to their local government, but it's we're not trying to tell anyone to do anything, but he was just interesting to me for those reasons. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree.
So next up, this one may be easy, maybe not. Corvus Corax.
I mean, he's just depressed, right?
Nevermore.
um, yeah, he's like depressed and in mourning. He's also, I mean, he's another one of those individuals that I would love to see what they do with him moving forward. If they ever bring him back, just because of the last thing that's written about him in the Horus Heresy,
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that.
um,
I mean,
because
and
it's so different,
it
and
is.
and it's
We're being very vague for
yeah.
spoiler reasons, but it's one of the things about him that I found interesting was, I mean, yeah, of course he's depressed. He's the Edgar Allan Poe reference built into Warhammer and all that, but
Hmm.
he's more than that, because every one of these Primarch characters is a bit more than maybe the joke that they were birthed from.
Yeah,
And we've seen that with the whole series, which is why these conversations are interesting and not just locker room nerd talk. Uh,
right.
so he's depressed, but he's also so vengeful. He's
Hmm.
he's got kind of a resentment complex of some kind where he just uh, there are things he can't accept, like the way that he treats his underlings when he finds out that there was maybe a superstitious element to even to the one who was ultimately responsible for his salvation, for him staying
Hmm.
alive instead of getting murdered by Angron. And he just has such a hard time reconciling that, and he goes on, he orchestrates these people's deaths because he just can't handle it.
Yeah. He's I don't know. I would love for them to bring back a different triumvirate and have it be, Russ returned, Valdor returned,
Hmm.
and Corvax all together.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Especially, I wonder how, uh, because speaking of custodians, I mean Valdor, he was really just anti-emotional, like completely.
Hmm.
I read his novel, and I was just kind of blown away by how, I mean, he's obviously incredibly gifted, but just
Hmm.
how emotionless he is.
Well, have you read Two Metaphysical Blades?
I have.
Okay, I think that's probably the reason why. I think the emotion gets beat out of him because of the spear and
Hmm.
what it does.
I mean, for a being who's immune to the temptations of chaos, getting rid of emotions seems like one way to sever him from that. But
Yeah.
oof. Ah, man, tangents. This is so fun. Okay. Next up on the list, because I know we're going long here. Uh, but we only have four left.
Okay,
Vulcan.
Vulcan. He he's a bit naive. Um,
I thought so as well.
yeah, he's he's almost pathologically naive.
Hmm.
He's the one that, like, if you gave him the choice, he would just like, I don't ever want to fight ever.
Yep.
And
I just want to make cool things and live
mhm.
in peace.
And I mean, he also is one of the most interesting, coolest Primarchs as well. So just because of his whole path and what he goes through and all of that. So yeah, beyond being like really naive, I don't. I mean, I think he's driven a little bit um, insane at one point in the story, but that's what happens when Conrad Cruz tortures you in the manner that he does.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
yeah. It's it reminds me of sort of the Soviet way of getting confessions from people, where they would just
mhm.
continually torture you night and day and always keep the lights on and never let you sleep, and
Yep.
really loud noises randomly, and just and
Mhm.
never let you sit down, and like all of the little things to where like that was how I looked at what happened to Vulcan. And of course he went crazy, because that, I mean, that scientifically speaking, that is the way you drive someone crazy. Don't do that,
Oh,
people.
absolutely. Yeah.
uh not advocating that at all. But and then he comes back from that, and
Mhm.
him coming back from that, I wanted to see them address it, but we haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen them address how it's like, okay, I went crazy and I died again, but now I'm better. How? Like,
I don't know that they're going to do that.
I want them
Although,
to though.
yeah, it would be nice if they did. Maybe Chris Rader and Dembski Bowden will write about it, and
Mhm,
we'll get some good answers.
maybe. But if there's anyone who's going to be there to maybe give Angron the hug he needs, it'll be
Yes.
Vulcan. There, I did the Vulcan live stomp stomp reference for all of you. Congratulations. Uh, all right. So next up, one of my favorite tragic, you know, root of his own evil sort of characters, uh, Magnus the Red.
Mm. Who, by his own admission, did everything wrong.
Yep,
Um,
it's canon. It's written there in the lore. Oh man, that killed me.
I mean, I don't. hubris for sure,
Definitely.
um, because he thinks he knows better than everyone else. And but beyond that, I mean, he's got definitely a fractured personality after Prospero.
Quite literally.
Yeah. And I have not read the latest book. That's the novella from the Siege of Terra series.
Yep, me neither.
But
So we can't spoil that one for anybody.
actually, I don't even know if that's out yet now that I think about it. Maybe
Maybe
it's
in the
just a
limited
limited.
version.
Yeah, but I didn't get that. So, oh well. Um, but to be honest, like I think beyond that, it's this it's the scientist that always wonders what's possible and always thinks they're right without ever questioning like should I do this or would this be okay or what are the bad things.
Yeah, Dr. Frankenstein character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, and that's an interesting archetype to me because I I find that a lot, and I see it a lot even in areas that I wouldn't expect. But like, there's constant themes, and you see this sometimes in religion, and you see this sometimes outside of religion, just in general storytelling of the character who's too smart for their own
Hmm.
good and
Yeah.
pushes things too far. And they there was something by, I can't remember if it was, I'm probably gonna get this reference wrong, but Nietzsche, when he's talking about this character and the death of God, and
Mm.
there's this guy who's yelling at a crowd like, "You killed God!" You And a lot of people kind of use this line as a, God is dead, as a way
Hmm.
of just kind of dismissing religion. But like in the full context of this story that he wrote, there was this person. It might be Dostoevsky, one of those two. Uh, Points out that like, you killed God, but you don't know what that means. You don't know what that means for you. Like, what are you accountable to now? Yourselves. You're not ready to be God. Like you
Hmm.
like, and it's a lot more complicated. And I see that in Magnus. It's just like this reckless push forward. And I mean, of course, such hubris, pride. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, I can think of so many other characters. I mean, there's Dr. Frankenstein, of course, Illidan from the Warcraft universe.
Hmm.
Um, there's plenty of wizard characters like,
Of course.
Raceland from Dragonlance
Hmm.
and stuff, and it's always associated with people who are really, really, smart, quote unquote. Uh, and then they always end up being wrong somehow, or like being right in the worst way. He's Magnus is interesting.
Yes. Yes, he is.
Okay, two left. We're saving your favorite for last. So that
Okay.
means that the only other one that we can talk about before that is my least favorite Primarch,
Oh yeah.
Lorgar Aurelian.
Hmm. Who again, Aaron Dembski Bowden made likable for a bit and made him not a total weak pansy that he was in the beginning. But even then, I think it's just it's this religious zealotry. Um, I
Like,
think,
driven by an ideology, basically, like,
yeah.
and like a desperation, almost an addiction, like Mortarion, to this
Mhm.
idea that's more important than the truth in front of him.
Yeah, and it's. I think it's very interesting, and I like how they've written in the fact that you know, he wasn't wrong. It just wasn't time. And many of the things that he put in place are still there and are cornerstones of the Imperium. But, he was doing them for the wrong reasons or at the wrong time back in the day. You know, he wrote the book that, has everything to do with, worshiping the God Emperor. Um, and, that's why I'm really interested in getting the third book in that trilogy. It was Dark Imperium, Plague War, and whatever the next one is.
Yeah,
because I really want to see what happens. So, but I think yeah, it's just that zealotry and a need to serve something greater than yourself and
And not
and
caring
give
what that
up.
is, like not
Yeah.
caring if it's worth, like if it deserves your adulation or
Hmm.
your respect.
Or what the cost is to you or the people around you. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
and that kind of goes back into the nihilism, you know,
Hmm.
because if he really was so smart and all of these things, if he really was a Primarch, then he understood that this would cause untold death, damage, and destruction, and
Hmm.
uh, he gloried in it. Like there's something very nihilistic about that to me.
Oh yeah.
So cool. Well, I don't
Mm.
want to waste any more time on Lorgar. So let's close this out. We'll do this last one, and then why don't we have you kind of plug your practice and everything, and if you have any resources you want to offer to people, and then we'll close this out. Unless you have anything else you want to talk about. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Lehman of the Russ.
I don't think there's anything wrong with him. I think he's fine. Um, um, you know what? I think if we're being honest, like I think he's a really for me he's one of the most interesting characters, and I really there's a lot more that I'd like to see written about him. But he goes through these very interesting changes. It's why like the very beginning of the book, Wolfsbane, is so interesting to me
The best
because he
parts
has
of
these.
that book, really, if you ask me.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And it's like, oh, that's how you say it. I'm sorry, I learned this language 6 days ago. Like, okay. But it's the fact that he is knowingly a hypocrite. Um, he knows he's a hypocrite and he does it anyway, and it's because he he's willing to do what he's told no matter the cost. And I think we don't see where he's ever told that, but it seems to be the impression he gets from the emperor is that like you must do that. And so in the same way that Lorgar is kind of driven by finding a purpose, Russ knows what his purpose is and is willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen, even if that means he sacrifices himself completely and his entire legion completely. And yeah,
That's an
so
interesting take on Russ. I see that. I'm gonna add, raise you, add my own kind of chip onto that. It's like I think that he has this ideal of what his role is that perhaps exceeds the role,
mhm.
and is just so driven to pursue it that he in almost an inverse of Magnus's grandiose hubris, Russ has his own kind of hubris that uh, is so determined to be, the most extreme version of what he sees his duty to be. But no one ever bothers, and the emperor never bothers to tell him to stop. So is he wrong? Like I don't know.
Mm.
Uh, but
Well,
he takes it to the extreme. He takes it so far.
yeah, and I have a theory as to why he gets away with it and why it happens. Is he was the second Primarch found,
Hmm.
and and at that point Horus was already like the apple of everybody's eye, and the Emperor and Horus would run around together, and so then the person who was left, the person who was next, was Malcador, and I think Russ and Malcador have, um, my guess would be a pretty deep personal kind of bond and connection and history
Secret
that just
handshake.
that never got really introduced to. And I also think Russ was the one that would kind of, and you see this a little bit in his Primarch novel, in his interactions um, with the Lion. You see it
Yeah.
in the Night of the Wolf with Angron. You see it in the way that he interacts with Perturabo. Like there's, or not Perturabo, with even when he interacts with Magnus, like those he has this way of being with people where it's kind of like, I'm your older brother and I'm going to keep you in line. And yes, there's the way we do things that's shiny and out and in public, but like I'm not the one to do that. I'm the one that's going to show you the ropes the real way, not the pretty way. And I
Sort
think
of a
he gets that
tragic
with
pragmatism. Yeah.
yeah, and I think he gets that with Malcador,
And
because
this,
Malcador too, like,
yeah.
will do whatever it takes to make it happen, regardless of whether or not it's necessarily the best.
Or even if he wants to do it. I think that's another
Yeah.
thing. Russ, he's doing things, but he isn't always doing them because he wants to. He feels it's basically without knowing the barbarian virtues, you can't appreciate the civilized ones. Something like that.
Mm.
I'm paraphrasing again. They want me to
Yeah.
subscribe, and I'm not going to do that to read the exact quote. Uh, but I think that that's Lehman Russ, and that's one of the
Hmm.
reasons I truly love Lehman Russ as a character as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I obviously Sanguinius is better, but Lehman Russ is fantastic for his own reasons.
Everyone's entitled to their own opinion.
Yes, we are. I know that bear I was poking, or that wolf rather. But well, thank you again for agreeing to come and talk to me about this stuff, and I appreciate you having fun with me with this last little segment here to kind of
No, no problem.
lighten the tone. Is there anything else you'd like to cover, or
Yeah, actually, we had talked at the beginning about kind of like signs that were important for like reaching out to a therapist.
yeah?
And I think it's important also just to kind of give people kind of a little bit of a heads up if they actually, if and when they actually do reach out to a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
kind of what to expect.
Ah, that's
Because
good. Yeah,
I think one of the things that happens for people is, they want help, but they expect it to work like a doctor's office,
yeah.
like your primary care physician. And we are not set up like that at all. We tend to do most of the work ourselves. We don't have nurses that work for us or schedulers or things like that. Simply because, I mean, the main reason is there's only so much brain capacity that we have, and doctors work on like somewhere between 3 to 5 patients an hour, and I only see one person an hour. So I can't work on the same like levels of scale that they can, and I can see about 35 people a week and still have my head on straight, but anything more than that, and it starts to get a little dicey for me. I kind of get a little overloaded, and it makes me not the best person in the world. So something to keep in mind when you reach out is that if you call and they don't answer, it's not because they don't want to pick up the phone. It's likely that they're already in session with someone. And so, because we don't have people who will answer the phone necessarily on the first ring, or at all, leave the message and they should call you back within 24 hours. Um, Another thing to understand is that many therapists don't um, they don't take insurance. Some of them do, and some of them have limited slots for insurance. They may not have any insurance slots left. Um, and for the ones that don't, uh, they're going to have a fee that's set, and you can ask them about sliding scale slots or that sort of thing. How much therapy costs in your area it's going to depend on the area. It's also going to depend on the level of expertise that you're interacting with. So someone like me who's has a PhD, who's a licensed psychologist, that's different than someone who is a trainee that's just kind of starting out and is under somebody else's supervision. So price point for me versus them is going to be different. They may have sliding scale fee that may be available for some people. The other thing I want to say too is that we had talked about making sure you find the right person, and therapists are very much a good phrase is that we're a lot like pants, in that you may have to try on a couple pair before you find the right fit. Uh, Fit is the most important thing for to kind of look for. Are you comfortable with this person, even if you're talking about uncomfortable things? Is it easy to talk to them? Do you feel like you click with them? Those are some of the things to kind of pay attention to.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
One of my favorite experiences with a therapist was, and one of the ways I knew, and this is kind of a personal quirk, I knew that
Hmm.
this person had my best interest at heart, is that he said to me at one point, "If you talk crap about yourself like that one more time, I'm going to punch you in the throat." And and that was the right answer for me.
Yeah.
Some
Yep.
people might feel very threatened by that, but he kind of read me and read the room well enough to know that. So I
Hmm.
I I agree with the idea that maybe you don't find someone the first time, because there was another one who I couldn't connect with them.
Yeah,
We
it
seemed to be
happens.
tripping over each other. I would be
Hmm.
trying to explain something, and they were already kind of 2 steps ahead of me. And for some people can operate on that level, but I didn't connect with that person very well. So
Okay.
I like what you had to say there.
Yeah. The other thing to say is that, a typical course of therapy within the first month, you're going to feel better. And then the next 3 to 6 months may be kind of difficult. It doesn't always go that way, but, that's when you're getting comfortable enough to talk about stuff. And it's hard work. It may seem like it's not, but that kind of intense introspection, if you're really doing the work, it's entirely possible for you to leave session feeling confused, dizzy, your mind is swimming, you feel off balance physically as well as mentally. Those things are possible. You could have something where you leave feeling amazing and then an hour later you feel incredibly depressed, or it could be the reverse. You leave feeling really depressed and you wake up the next day and you feel like $1,000,000. Um, those are all normal things as your internal kind of psychological structure is getting kind of examined and tinkered with. So oftentimes my experience with people is they'll be in it for a little while and they'll feel a little better, and then they'll feel kind of stagnated and they'll feel like, hey, we're finally getting somewhere. But I often find like that point where they want to bail is actually when we're finally ready to actually do the work. Um, because sometimes it takes a while to get in that same connection with someone else.
I think
But anyway,
too,
yeah.
your low point is also the point where you're maybe the most open to change,
Hmm.
uh, as well. So I mean, it is deconstructing a lot of things. So I think that's
Hmm.
also very good. Um,
Yeah.
oh, I know when I first started therapy, I thought it's like, all right, well, I'll talk to this person 3 times and I should feel better. And if I don't, then either something's too wrong with me to fix, or this person is worthless at their job. And that's not at all how it works. So
No, not at all.
cool.
So
Well, that was
um,
definitely worth adding in.
yeah. So, I mean, if you are at home and you feel like maybe you would benefit from therapy, first I'll say yes, you would. And second, I would say, reach out to those who are around you. Um, you can look up therapists in your area. Psychology Today has a really good listing, and most people are on Psychology Today. Just put your city, kind of what you're looking for. You'll be able to look at people's bios. You can also just do a basic Google search for your symptoms and kind of like see what's going on, like therapy for anxiety, therapy for depression, any of that kind of thing. There's lots of ways to find a therapist, and you can read about them, talk to them a bit on the phone when you call, and kind of find out what's going on. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and
yeah.
there's also, and something that I've seen benefit a lot of people. It's something that's a little bit maybe more common where I'm from, but a lot of employers, as part of their benefit structure, have an employee assistance program, and not every
Hmm.
therapist will take patients from an EAP,
Hmm.
but if you can find someone within that network, there's usually a list. If you check
Hmm.
your benefits with work and see if you have access to an EAP.
Hmm.
Uh, I had a great one where the first 5 visits were completely covered, and then the rest was
Yeah.
billed to insurance, and
Hmm.
that was an excellent way for me to get that. And they would, if I didn't connect with the right person, they would start the free visits over with the next person until I found and went through the whole cycle. So, you know, check with
Yeah,
your work too.
that's really generous of them to do. And just because work sets you up with someone and helps with that process, work doesn't get to know what goes on in session.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the therapist won't be reporting back anything about anything. The other thing to say is if you have PPO insurance, that is something that there's such a thing as out of network providers. So your therapist may not work with insurance, but if you have a PPO insurance, you can still get some reimbursement back from it to make it a little bit more cost effective. So,
Yep.
and then, the only other thing I would say is, if you're in the Los Angeles area and you like listening to me and would like to work with me specifically, feel free to reach out. My website is drnahumck.com. So it's DRNAHUM as in mother, CK.com. My website's there. You can You can email me there. You can schedule a phone call with me there. Um, I'm happy to help people. And if I'm not a good fit, I know, I don't know, 50 or 60 different therapists that I can refer to. So
That's awesome. And I would again recommend it because not everybody lives in California, and not everybody
no,
who lives in California realizes that. But just a little friendly jab there.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
there are other resources as well, and of course there are certain emergencies that require that a little bit more than just a hey, we'll call you back within 24 hours. If you
of
are
course.
feeling like you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, if you're kind of at that breaking point, uh, call 911. Get ahead, get
Hmm.
a hold of someone right away if it's an emergency.
Hmm.
And uh, there's various hotlines. I know soon there's going to be a hotline set up, kind of 911 for suicide in the U.S., but that's not up yet. I'm glad to see that that's something that's happening. But if you feel like there's a more urgent need, then you could wait for a call back, then call 911 and talk and get a hold of somebody right away.
You can also just, I mean, if it feels that severe, and you have someone else in your household, you can have them just take you to an emergency room. And if you go to an emergency room and you talk to the people there and you say that you're struggling because you're worried that you're going to harm yourself, um, they will put you to the front of the line and they will help you out. Um, you don't have to wait for someone to come to you. You can go to the emergency room yourself, and they will do what they need to do to make sure that you're safe.
Awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation. We touched on some serious points. We touched on some silly points. We poked some fun at each other and our favorite Primarchs.
Of
And
course.
I really enjoy this conversation. Thanks so much, Dr. Chris Nahumck, for coming on and talking to me about this. If I can put together some resources, I'll put it in the description for the video that this is going to be attached to. And of course, thanks again to Frontline for letting me put all my word salad on their website. So, uh, with that in mind, I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening, Chris, and
I
I look
will.
forward to talking to you again some
Yeah,
other time.
anytime.
All right.
Anytime.
Cool. Take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for watching this video and participating in the ongoing conversation we're all having about mental health, particularly in 2020. If you like this content, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. If you have anything that you'd like to ask or talk about so far as mental health goes, or if you want to correct me on what you think my diagnoses of the Primarchs are, feel free to send me a message or leave me a comment. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.